would like to take an opportunity to continue to move on and introduce our keynote speaker. Bill Symonds is the director of the Pathways to Prosperity Project, which is based at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. The Pathways Project was created in 2008 to find promising solutions to our national failure to prepare many young adults for success. In February 2011, the Pathways Project released a report entitled Pathways to Prosperity, Meeting the Challenge of Preparing Young Adults for the 21st Century. The report has generated enormous interest from around the nation, and as a result, the Pathways Project has partnered with several states seeking to implement the Pathways vision for preparing young people. Mr. Symonds helped develop the Pathways Project while he was a senior fellow at Harvard's John F. Kennedy School of Government from 2007 to 2008. Prior to that, he spent nearly 25 years as a senior correspondent and bureau chief for Business Week magazine. He also served as Business Week's chief education correspondent for many years and has wrote extensively about the role of U.S. business in school reform. Please help me welcome Mr. Bill Symonds.
Good morning.
Good morning.
It's really a pleasure to be with you today. You know, while I've never lived in Nebraska, every time I come here, it feels like I'm coming back home. I grew up primarily in Missouri, graduated from high school in southern Minnesota. My first job was in Des Moines, and my parents lived for a long time in Wisconsin, so I certainly know a lot about the Midwest, feel more like home here than anywhere else. And so I'm really delighted that so many of you are here this morning. How many of you are representing the business community? We got a really good turnout from business. That's really terrific. We're going to talk about the importance of business in solving these and addressing these issues. So as Corey mentioned, we released our report in early 2011, about a year and a half ago now. This is what it looks like in hard copy in Washington. And at that time, we really didn't know how much interest a report like this would generate. You know, at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, we have a library, of course, as you would expect, which is filled with volume after volume of studies that have been done in education. Most of those studies are just gathering dust. They come out, there's a brief flurry of interest, and then that's the last you hear of it. This report, however, has generated extraordinary interest. So one way to start looking at this is I know a lot of you are interested in football. As a matter of fact, when I worked at Business Week, I had the opportunity to write a story about the Cornhuskers. At that time, and I'm sure this won't surprise any of you, some of the national media was casting aspersions on what was going on here in Lincoln. So I came in as had something of a background as an investigative reporter to see what really was going on. And I met Tom Osborne, had a chance to spend a long time with him, and also got introduced to the program they had at that time to have tutors work with students if they really wanted that help. I thought it was a really impressive program. I also met some of the outstanding student athletes who were on the team, one of whom went on to become a lawyer. And then I read a number of years ago when there was a terrorist explosion in Bali. He was actually killed in that explosion. Some of you may know who I'm talking about. Anyhow, Tom Osborne is certainly an incredible leader, and the program he had set up, at least as I saw it, was really impressive. So I thought one way to talk about the interest this report has created is to look at, Nebraska, of course, for many years was part of the Big 12. If you look at the states in the Big 12, I've now been to every state that was part of the original Big 12 except for Iowa. And if you look at the states that are involved in the Big Ten, schools where the Big Ten schools are represented, I've been to all of those states as well, with the exception of Iowa. However, one of our strongest supporters is in Iowa, which is ACT, the testing organization that focuses on college and career readiness. They're based in Iowa City, of course, and so we've got some representation in Iowa as well. Nationally, at this point, we've now spoken in more than 30 states. A number of those states have had symposiums just like you're having here today, where we bring together key stakeholders, government leaders, educators, business leaders, and talk about how can we do a better job of preparing all kids for success. And I think that's a fundamental thing I want to talk about. For too long, we've been focused really on the elite, as the commissioner just talked about. You know, the kids who are going to go on and become doctors and lawyers, which is fine, But really, in the 21st century, we have to look at the entire population of young people. How are we going to help all of them become successful? We're not looking just at those students who are going to go to the University of Nebraska, but at the entire population of young people in Nebraska. How are they going to become productive in a dynamic part of this economy? So I've been to more than 30 states in every geography, all of the New England states, pretty much every state in the Midwest. In the West, the entire West Coast, including Hawaii. Fortunately, that conference was held in February, which is nice if you live in New England, because it's pretty cold there in February. And also in the Southwest and South. Tremendous interest in Oklahoma, for example. I was just in Georgia a couple of months ago, South Carolina, North Carolina. So it really spreads all across the country. And in this time of political polarization, this is one issue in which it seems to engage both the Republicans and Democrats. And probably the best example of that I can think of was last year. I was invited to speak at the state capitol in Madison, Wisconsin. We all know that Wisconsin has seen more than its share of political polarization. One recall drive after another, culminating with the drive to recall Governor Walker. So I walked into that atmosphere, and on that day, there were Democratic leaders sitting next to Republican leaders because they were so interested in this issue. That was about the only meeting they had last year that brought together leaders of both parties to talk about this. So it really is a bipartisan issue. This is not something that's resonating just in blue states or red states. It's really cutting across the entire political spectrum. And I think that's because everybody realizes that one of our most fundamental obligations as a society is to prepare our young people to lead successful lives as adults. And that's really a broader definition of education success I think we ought to hold in our minds. You know, for a long time we've heard that the goal of education is raising test scores. Test scores are certainly important, and I support the idea of accountability, but the ultimate goal is, what is that young person going to do when they leave the education system? How are they going to make a contribution to our society? That's the issue we really need to focus on, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. So the question you might be asking is, why is this one report generating so much interest? And I think there's several reasons for this. First of all, we've been on a course of school reform. Somebody mentioned the idea of the report, A Nation at Risk, which came out in 1983. That really galvanized a generation of school reform which was focused on lifting academic performance and academic standards. Led to the standards movement, the passage of No Child Left Behind, and as we now know, testing has really become present throughout our school system. But I think there's growing recognition that that approach to school reform was really too narrowly focused. It has helped in some ways, and certainly accountability is important in education, but it certainly has not achieved the goals that were promised at the beginning. You know, when No Child Left Behind was passed, we were told that every child in America was going to be proficient in math and reading by 2014. Now that 2014 is just around the corner, the Secretary of Education has been granting waivers to states so they won't have to live up to that. So clearly, you know, we didn't achieve that goal. At the same time, we've seen dramatic changes in our economy, which has really put the American dream at risk for many Americans, especially young Americans. You know, we hear about the unemployment crisis all the time, but what many Americans don't realize is this crisis is far worse when you look at our young people than it is among those over the age of 25. Unemployment among those under the age of 25 has more than doubled in recent years, and I think many of you heard the recent study that came out which looked at recent four-year college graduates. These are students who have already earned their bachelor's degree. 53% of those students are either totally unemployed or they're underemployed, meaning they've got a job that doesn't really require a four-year degree. The New York Times did a front-page story about that and profiled one young woman who I think went to the University of Northern Ohio. She came out with $120,000 in debt. She was living in her parents' basement, working two jobs as a waitress, with no clear avenue to success. So even among four-year college graduates, there's a real crisis in getting into the labor market. At the same time, many of the measures of the economic well-being of our average families are declining. Median income has been falling. Net worth of many families has been falling. And in this environment, I had an opportunity recently to hear the chairman of Gallup speak, and he's written a book about this, and he says that in America now, the number one concern, overriding all others, is having a good job. Now, what do they mean by having a good job? Coaching the Cornhuskers? That's not what he's talking about. He's not talking about a dream job, something that everybody would like to have. What he's talking about is a job that pays you to work at least 30 hours a week. That's a very low bar. You're just getting paid to work 30 hours a week, and yet that's the number one concern that Americans have right now, having a good job. So the bottom line is, in this environment, we have a huge opportunity to move the needle on education reform and really develop what I'd call a more realistic and practical approach to this. And I think as we go through the presentation this morning, you're going to see what I'm talking about. This is not a call for radical reform. It's really a call for common sense reform. One of the ideas we're going to be talking about today, for example, is the importance of career counseling. And I'm delighted that Dr. Rich Feller from Colorado State is here. He's going to be speaking to you later. He's president of one of the leading organizations in career counseling. Now, stop and think about it. Career counseling is not a radical idea. You're talking to young people about, you're spending a lot of time in school. What do you want to do with this someday? Why is that radical? To me, it's just common sense, and yet we're ignoring this. How many people in this room had any meaningful career counseling when you were in high school? I see one hand there. So, this is typical as I go around the country. I've been in audiences with over 500 people. We might have 2 hands go up. This is something we've totally ignored in our education system, yet it's just common sense, isn't it? Why aren't we talking to young people about what they're going to do with themselves, about all the exciting opportunities that are out there? Somehow that's something that we've totally ignored. So I think we have a huge opportunity, given what's going on in our society, to make some real changes in this. So this morning I'd like to talk to you about the Pathways Report, some of the research we did and what we found, what our recommendations were. I'd like to talk about the states that have rolled up their sleeves and are already taking action on this, and that's the exciting thing. A number of really important states, including the state of Washington, New York, Massachusetts, and Illinois, are already taking direct action in response to the report. I'd like to tell you about the next plans for the Pathways Project and how Nebraska can get involved in that. And of course, the key purpose of today is to talk about what you here in this room can contribute to this challenge, how we can develop a game plan for Nebraska moving forward. So let's start out by talking about the Pathways Challenge. When we started the Pathways Project back in the fall of 2008, we were asked 2 very broad questions. The first one is, why are we failing so many of our young people? That's the first question. And the second question is, what can we do about it? What can we do to make a really significant impact? So that implied we have to do something more than open another charter school, because that's going to help maybe a few kids. It's not going to solve the whole problem. So really the first question was, why are we failing so many of our young people? And our conclusion is that we're increasingly failing to prepare many of our young people to lead successful lives as adults. Matter of fact, we think we're failing about half of them right now. Now, why has this happened? The first one is, if you look what's happened with our education system. For over a century, we led the world in education by pretty much every measure. Going all the way back to the time of the Civil War, we were already #1 in education because we in America believed that every child deserved a grammar school education. Every child needed to learn how to read, write, and do some arithmetic. And so because we believed that, we were ahead of other countries which reserved education only for a few people. Then at the turn of the last century, something called the high school movement sprung up. This is a very interesting phenomenon. This was not a decree from the White House. It wasn't an act of Congress. It was people in communities like Omaha and Lincoln deciding, if we're going to prepare our kids to succeed in the 20th century, we need to create high schools. They need to move beyond grammar school. And so the high school movement spread like wildfire across the U.S. By the beginning of World War II, a high school education was common. The average young person had a high school degree. At the beginning of the 20th century, that was not true. So that was the next change. We led the world in adopting the idea that high school is something that young people need. Then after World War II, the GI Bill was passed, and there was a tremendous explosion in post-secondary education. Not only four-year colleges, but the growth of the community college movement, technical colleges, et cetera. And we led the world in that. We were by far the best educated nation in the world. But in the last generation, we've lost our leadership. We're no longer in the top 10 in high school graduation. We're not the leader in college graduation. We are #1 by one dubious metric, which is producing dropouts. As a matter of fact, we're the leading nation in the world now in producing college dropouts. And one of the reactions to this report has been the Chinese have gotten very interested in that. I recently did a radio talk show in Beijing on why do so many American kids drop out of college. They don't see that phenomena in China. Now, fortunately, that call-in show was in English. Otherwise, it would have been in real trouble if it was in, if it was in Mandarin. So we've lost our leadership in education. The second thing is that we've had this crisis develop in youth employment. Now, many of you in this room, I'm sure, when you were in high school, you had a summer job. You got some work experience. That was common. Today, that's no longer common. Fewer than 30% of our teenagers are employed during the summer. They're not getting that basic work experience. And as we've already discussed, even many four-year college graduates are having great difficulty integrating into the workforce. So we have a real crisis getting that work experience. The problem is the ages of 16 to 24 are really critical for learning some key life skills you're going to need to succeed, including some of the key skills that are needed to succeed in any kind of work. The importance of showing up on time. How do you deal with the general public and with customers? Are you dressed appropriately? Those very basic skills are really the fundamental building blocks to being successful in any arena. If you don't have a job, you're not going to acquire those skills. You're not going to learn why it's so important. And so that's another major problem. And of course, as the commissioner just told us, we face a lot of mounting social problems even here in Nebraska, a growing rise of youth poverty. There's 1.6 million young people, for example, who are homeless, children who are homeless. There's been a decline in the family. The majority of children being born to women under the age of 30 today are being born outside of marriage. So by definition, there's only one person around, and that mother is usually living in poverty. It's not a pretty situation. It creates a lot more challenges for educators. So the overall danger we face is that we may be left with what I call a wasted generation. And I'm doing that in contrast to the greatest generation. So think back to what happened in World War II. We were in the middle of a Great Depression. The Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, and the cry went out that we needed every young man, and many young women as well, to step forward and serve their country. It was really a national call to service, and virtually everybody did step forward. It really was amazing. After the war, the GI Bill was passed, which gave many of those young people the opportunity to continue their education. The result of all of that was the greatest generation, and we've all heard stories, and I know many of you in your own family had people who epitomized that generation, how much they gave back to our society. Today we face the opposite problem. We're in danger of leaving many of our young people on the sidelines of life, not really being productive citizens, and if we end up with that situation, we're not going to have a successful economy here in Nebraska or anywhere across the country. So that's the challenge we face. That's why we're here today. Now, let's break this down and look at it in a little more detail. The first place to start is the labor market, what's been going on. So, as we've already heard this morning, a generation ago, you could really say that a high school degree was the passport to the American dream. If you had a high school degree, the chances were really good. You could get a good job, have a middle-class standard of living, and enjoy a comfortable retirement. As recently as 1973, almost 3 out of 4 workers had no more than a high school degree, and yet they were enjoying that American dream. I saw this when I was at Business Week. My first assignment was in Pittsburgh, and I was covering the American steel industry. And there was a place called Homestead, Pennsylvania. Some of you may have heard about it. It was one of the largest steel mills in the world, the Homestead Works. And at the Homestead Works, you could come out of high school, get a job in the mill, starting at the bottom, and work your way up, retire, and lead a good life. It really epitomized middle-class America. They had the largest Chevy dealer in the U.S. there. They had one of the largest movie theaters. Today, if you go there, though, the Homestead Works has been demolished. It doesn't exist at all. Hundreds of thousands of jobs in the steel industry have been wiped out in that part of western Pennsylvania. So what's happened is that kind of work has been replaced by different jobs that increasingly require some training and education beyond high school, post-secondary education. Today, you can really say that that kind of education is the passport to the American dream in 2012. You need to go beyond high school and get some further education. And as a matter of fact, if you look at jobs being created right now, 63% of those require some education beyond high school. But this graphic here goes to the heart of the issue we're going to be talking about this morning. I think many of you, and certainly citizens across the state, have come to believe the only path forward is to go to a 4-year college in this new economy. That's really the only pathway to success. The reality, though, if you look at the labor market, is really very dramatically different. So this breaks down jobs being created in the current decade, what's being created across the country right now. And the dark red there, 33%, those are jobs that do require a 4-year degree or higher. If you want to be an engineer, you've got to go to a 4-year school. A doctor, a lawyer, et cetera, you've got to go to a 4-year school. The orange part of the pie, though, the 30%, those are jobs that require some training beyond high school, but less than a 4-year degree. And I would argue this is a segment of the economy that we've really overlooked. Even though there are many good jobs here, we've stigmatized those jobs, saying those are second-class jobs. You really don't want your kids to go in that area, even though that slice of the pie is almost as large as the 4-year slice of the pie. And that's really why we're in such a real predicament. We've lost the connection between what does the labor market demand, how much education do you need to succeed there. We've taken sort of a one-size-fits-all approach, and it just isn't working today anymore. The top slice of the pie, the 36%, those are jobs that still require a high school education or less. The problem is many of those jobs don't pay very well or offer much in the way of benefits, so it's really not the best direction for our young people. But the bottom line is that 2/3 of the jobs do not require a 4-year college degree, 2/3 of the jobs. So suggesting that everybody needs to go to a 4-year college simply doesn't make any sense. Now, this is an example of what's going on in the healthcare industry. We're going to be hearing from one of the leaders in the healthcare industry here in Nebraska later today. You can see that over 78% of the jobs require less than a 4-year degree. Now, you can't just walk in off the street and do these jobs. They do require advanced training, many of them very advanced technical skills. They pay well, but they do not require a 4-year degree. And that's something many people have overlooked. And that's true of many industries, by the way. So if we break it down and look at Nebraska, by 2018, Nebraska is expected to have 1.1 million jobs. And 66% of these jobs are going to require some education beyond high school. However, only 29% are going to require a 4-year degree or higher. Only 29%. 37% are going to require an associate's degree or some college. So I know we have leaders from the community college system here. What this shows is the segment of education you represent is actually more important in terms of the jobs you represent in the Nebraska economy than the University of Nebraska is. The problem is your colleges aren't going to be playing for the national championship, so you're not going to get the same kind of attention. But actually, in terms of the contribution you're making to the economy, the training you're providing is actually more relevant and important than the 4-year colleges in terms of the number of jobs that are represented. And that's something we really need to focus on as we move forward. So another issue you've heard a lot about is the so-called skills gap. Employers who cannot find the people they need. And as I've gone around the country, I've heard this again and again. I was just in Oshkosh a couple of weeks ago, and so there was the president of a manufacturing company there. He pays everybody at least $36,000 a year. That's the lowest he pays anybody. He can't find the people he needs. He needs people with advanced welding skills, for example. He can't find them. He's running ads. They aren't there. If you go through a strictly academic approach to education, of course, you're not going to learn how to weld. That's not going to come up. So I think one reason we face this skills gap is we've convinced parents and many students there's only one road to heaven, so to speak. Take an academic program of study in high school, take your ACT or SAT, and go someplace like the University of Nebraska or Creighton and get your 4-year degree. The problem is that doesn't provide you with the skills needed for many of today's jobs. It doesn't work for many kids because they end up dropping out before they get their degree. And so the result is that a lot of young people are not getting the training they need for the well-paying jobs we have in today's economy. So one of the organizations that's got very interested in pathways is something called NCCER, National Center for Construction, Education, and Research. Their board includes companies like Exxon, DuPont, Fluor. And I went to one of their recent board meetings down in Gainesville, which is where they're based in Florida. And they were telling me that they've got a lot of very high-paying jobs doing things like maintaining oil refineries and chemical plants. Maybe that's not glamorous work, but those jobs all pay well over $50,000 a year. And by the way, that's at a time when the average American is making less than $30,000 a year. They pay over $50,000 a year. They offer tremendous security because if you're running an oil refinery, unless Americans stop driving, there's going to be demand for gas tomorrow and you're going to have a job. and yet they can't find the people they need. They're really worried about the future of their labor force. Their labor force is aging. They've got a bunch of aging baby boomers in those jobs right now. They don't see the young people coming forward who are going to fill those jobs. It's a great example of the skills gap problem. In Hawaii, they have a problem in the tourism industry. I spoke out there, we had a Pathways Summit, and a lot of their education reform has been oriented to so-called STEM jobs, science, technology, engineering, and math. Now, I don't have anything against STEM, it's certainly critically important, but if you look at the Hawaiian economy, and you don't have to have a PhD in economics to understand this, tourism is still the bedrock of that economy. That's something they had ignored. They'd really given it short shrift. What was the effect of that? The University of Hawaii did a study and found out that Hawaii had actually lost its lead in terms of tourism. About half the tourists that come to Hawaii are from Asia, and they found the quality of service you get as a tourist in Asia is far higher than what it is in Hawaii. They're not paying attention to that competition. And if you don't pay attention to the global competition, you're going to lose market share and decline. So they were ignoring really the bedrock of their economy and how they can meet that. Now you might be saying, Bill, tourism, you really don't need any training for that. Anybody can be a waiter or run a hotel. Well, in Switzerland, they too take it seriously. If you want to go into hospitality in Switzerland, not only do you have to do an extensive apprenticeship in that industry, you're expected to come out trilingual. Switzerland is a bilingual country, so you're expected to speak French and German. You also have to learn English, so you can deal with all the American tourists who come, who don't speak, probably don't speak French or German. So in Switzerland, they take it really seriously. They've raised the quality of their tourism industry as a result. In Hawaii, they aren't doing that. In Wyoming, they face a similar problem. I was speaking in Gillette, in the energy industry out there, where they don't see people going into that industry, even though the jobs are there. Many of them are going to the University of Wyoming, even though studies have shown that the majority of students who go to the University of Wyoming and graduate end up leaving the state. They aren't staying in Wyoming to take those jobs that are needed. In manufacturing, and I'm sure you see this in Nebraska as well, there's a skills gap all across the country in manufacturing. Boeing, for example, which is the leading manufacturer of high value added goods with their jets, faces a real pipeline challenge in the Puget Sound area, where young people are not coming out with the skills they need to fill those jobs. So given all of this, what we're arguing is that we need to broaden our definition of success in the US. We need to move away from the idea there's only one road to heaven. The only road forward is to get a four-year college degree. What we need to do instead is recognize the pathway you take should depend on where you want to go. It only makes common sense. Where do you want to end up in the economy? What's the role you want to play? Depending on that should determine the way forward for you. So what we need to do is move away from just glorifying the four-year degree and saying, let's recognize there's multiple pathways to success, all of which have validity depending on what you want to do. And this means that community and technical colleges play a far more important role than we've traditionally recognized. Apprenticeships have a vital role to play, and we really need to expand those. The military, quite frankly, does a great job at career education. We can learn a lot from them. Now, we're not saying we should shut down the four-year colleges at all. Obviously, a lot of careers do demand a four-year education. What we're saying, though, is we have to move away from this elitist approach to education. And I see this again and again. Kids who decide to go to a community and technical college are often made to feel like they're failures. They're second-class citizens. They really they're not on the road to success. But you know, in today's economy, one of the interesting things that's happening is many students who go to four-year colleges end up coming back to the community and technical colleges to get their education. The largest graduate school in the state of Wisconsin right now is Milwaukee Area Technical College, known as MATC. MATC is celebrating its 100th birthday this year. They serve over 50,000 students, providing technical education needed for jobs in manufacturing, construction, et cetera. The reason they're the #1 graduate school is students who come out of the University of Wisconsin with a degree in political science, for example, or psychology, don't exactly find the employers knocking on their doors saying, come work for us. Matter of fact, many of them can't find a job at all, at least not a job that requires that kind of degree. So they go back to MATC and learn the technical skills they need to get employed. So again, we've got to move away from the stigmatizing and recognize that what pathway you take should really depend on what you want to do with your life. And all of these have value. If we're going to have a productive and a successful society, these jobs are vitally important. I think anybody who drives a car recognizes we need refineries. We can't operate without them. So why are we stigmatizing people who work in refineries? We need to recognize that's a skill we need. It's a vital part of our economy. People who go down that pathway should be made to feel like they're on a good pathway and not somehow a second-class citizen. So, as I said at the beginning, we've been sort of on one pathway on education reform in this country, sort of an elitist pathway, really stressing academic success above all else. How have we done as we've gone down that approach? And the answer, unfortunately, is we haven't done that well. If you look at what's happened to high school graduation rates, they've remained pretty stagnant despite all the money we've put into, quote, fixing our schools. There really hasn't been a lot of increase. Today, over 1 million kids still drop out of high school every year. If we look at colleges, we've done a great job convincing young people they need to go to college. The problem is many of them go and end up without a degree. And this shows you the so-called on-time college graduation rate. Now, for four-year schools, what they mean by on-time is actually 6 years. What happens after 6 years? After 6 years, only 56% end up with a bachelor's degree, only 56%. The others do not get that degree. And if you look at two-year schools, it's only 29% who get an associate's degree after 3 years. Now, what happens to the other kids is they end up with a lot of debt and no degree. And I met one young man like that just a couple of weeks ago. My oldest son is going off to college. He wants to be an engineer. So he had fixed up a 1984 Chevy as a project. Our neighbor gave him that car, and he was able to get it on the road. So he was selling it for $500, which was actually a pretty good profit because he didn't pay anything for it to begin with. And he put an ad in Craigslist, and this young man showed up to buy it. His name was Brian. And I started talking to Brian. I said, Brian, what's your story? And he said, well, I graduated from the local high school. We live outside Boston 3 years ago. And the counselors, of course, told me I had to go to a four-year college. So they didn't do any investigation at all. Do your parents have any money? Do you have a college fund set up? What's your situation? They said, we're going to send you down to Emerson College. We think that would be a good fit for you. Well, Emerson is one of these colleges that charges about $50,000 a year. Brian's parents hadn't saved up any money. They couldn't help him. He took on $80,000 of loans, and he found out, this isn't for me. There's nothing down here that's helping me figure out what I want to do. He ended up dropping out. But he dropped out with $80,000 in debt. Then he went to see a financial counselor who said, you're going to have to pay $800 a month for the next 10 years to get out from this. Now, this is a young man who's only 20 years old, and that's what he's staring in the face. I think that's financially, that's frankly simply irresponsible to treat a young person like that, and yet that's what we've gotten into because we've suggested that's the only way forward. He would have been much better off in a program that allowed him to explore some other career alternatives other than just going to a four-year college. So that's one reason why we have so many dropouts today. So the bottom line is, if you look at young people at the age of 27, about 10 years out of high school, only 40% of them have a post-secondary degree. 30% have a four-year degree or higher, another 10% have an associate's degree. So the majority do not have a college degree. Now, that's one side of the equation. I'm sure you've all heard the buzzword about we want our kids to be college and career ready. Nebraska's adopted that just like most other states have. We focused a lot on the college ready piece. What about the career ready? And if you look at that side of the equation, the news is a lot bleaker. In recent years, there's been a whole slew of reports done by business organizations who said that the young people they see coming out of the system really are not ready to succeed in the workforce. And so the Conference Board and a couple of other organizations did a report called Are They Ready to Work? They interviewed hundreds of employers and asked them, do you see the graduates, high school graduates and college graduates, really with the skills you need? And overwhelmingly, they said high school graduates are not prepared to succeed in the workforce. They also had major questions about some of the college graduates. So the employers have sounded the alarm. At the same time, our young people are not getting the real world work experience they need to find out what it's like to be part of the working world and all that's involved with that. Teen employment now is at the lowest level since the Great Depression, and young adults, as we discussed, those aged 20 to 24, are really struggling to find their way in the labor market. So this graphic here, done by Andy Sum at Northeastern University, shows what I'm talking about. A decade ago, more than 1 out of 2 high school students was employed during the summer. By the summer of 2010, that'd fallen to only 29%. And if you break that down by income and look at kids living in families making less than $20,000 a year, only 9% of those teenagers had a job in the summer. Now stop and think about that. If you're living in a family making less than $20,000 a year, frankly, any income is going to be a contribution to the family's welfare, any income. And of course, those kids especially need the work skills they would get if they had a job, any kind of job. Why it's important to show up on time, et cetera. They're not getting that experience. 91% of them were unemployed, essentially. They didn't have the opportunity to work. So we've really ignored this problem. It's a massive crisis. That's why we're calling all of you here together today to figure out how we can address this in Nebraska and create a better environment for our young people. And finally, one other piece of the puzzle is the growing gender gap. If you go to colleges across the country, like I've been doing, you'll see that they're dominated today by young women. 57% of today's college students are young women, only 43% are men. And that flows through the entire system in terms of the percentage of graduates and also those in graduate school. In graduate school, it's actually 60% female, only 40% male. I think it speaks volumes about our failure to engage many of today's young men. So the question we started out asking is, why are we leaving so many of our young people behind? Why aren't we preparing them for success? Now, there have been a lot of answers given to that question in recent years. A lot of people have blamed teachers and the teachers' unions. You know, if only we could abolish the unions, we'd fix the problem. If only we could get better teachers in there, that would solve the problem. You know, I think that's one piece of the puzzle, but I think the broader reason, the more important reason is that our focus has just been too narrow. We've taken a one-size-fits-all approach. Now, why have we done that? One reason is that our leaders, let's take President Obama. I was listening to Michelle Obama last night. She's talking about how going to college really transformed her life. It worked really well for her. The problem is, as we've just seen, it doesn't work well for every young person in America. What she didn't mention in her address was the need to develop multiple pathways so we can help all those young people succeed. She came out of the south side of Chicago. Any of you who've been to Chicago know the rampant poverty and other problems that afflict the south side. It's really tragic. About half the kids in the south side of Chicago drop out of high school. They're not succeeding on the model of education she's talking about, yet we persist in this because our leaders, frankly, they succeeded at this system. They were products of that system. They did really well. They think it's going to work for everybody else. I think the evidence overwhelmingly suggests it doesn't work for everybody. We need to develop a broader focus, and that's, I think, the key reason why we haven't succeeded. So our conclusion is we need a broader, more holistic system of pathways to prosperity. Now, what would that look like? To answer that question, we spent some time looking at what other countries are doing, because we're not the only advanced industrial country that needs to figure out how they're going to help their young people succeed. So another reason to look at other countries is they're passing us up. We've fallen from 1st to 13th place in high school graduation, for example. So we were helped by the fact that while we were doing our study, the OECD, Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, which represents the leading industrial countries around the world, was actually doing the most in-depth study ever done of vocational education around the world. They looked at 17 different countries, including the US. And their report, which was published called Learning for Jobs, showed that vocational education is actually a key explanation for why these other countries are surpassing us. So what's happening in these countries? If we look at Europe and the countries in Europe that are still doing well, I'm not talking about Greece and Spain right now. If we look at Switzerland, Austria, Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands, for example, if you look what's going on there, about half or more of the kids at the high school level, 10th grade and beyond, are involved in vocational education. Now, we're not talking about dipping your toe in the water. This is really an intense approach. In Switzerland, 2 out of 3 kids in high school are involved in vocational education. What they do is they go out, they leave the high school, they go to a place of employment, wherever it may be. They offer them over 200 different career options, whether that's auto mechanics, learning how to work in the hospitality industry, going into the IT industry, et cetera. You spend the next 3 years at that place of employment learning on the job. You're being taught the technical skills you need to succeed, and they're combining that with academic instruction as well. They're not throwing that overboard. So you're actually getting paid while you're working as an apprentice there. So you draw an apprentice wage, you're working at the place of employment, you're doing your academic study. When they graduate, they are thoroughly prepared to succeed in that field of study. It's really an intensive approach to preparation for life and career success. So the OECD looked at programs like that and said, what can we learn from this? What's the real benefit of this approach? And there were three main conclusions they reached. The first one is pedagogically. What do you learn? And their conclusion was this approach to education is actually more effective for most young people. Now, let's look at what's going on here at the US. How do we train people in the US? A friend of mine trains surgeons at Mass General Hospital, which has been ranked as one of the top hospitals in the US. So how do they train surgeons? To get into a surgical residency program, you have to have an MD degree. You've already graduated from medical school. But when you get into that program, my friend says, he tells the young people, he said, you know, we're done with the multiple choice test. That's over with. I'm going to give you a scalpel. We're going to go into the operating room, and we're going to see if you can remove somebody's gallbladder. Hopefully, they're not going to tell the patient about this ahead of time. And he said, then he says, I'm going to find out very quickly that some of you don't have what it takes to become a surgeon. You don't have the manual dexterity. You know, you don't want a guy with a hand going like this becoming a surgeon. Or you may not have the psychological makeup. Let's face it, not all of us have the psychological makeup to operate on somebody. I know I don't. So he said, my most important job is to figure out who among you really are not qualified to be a surgeon. You don't have the makeup it takes. This is work-based learning. This is not taking an academic exam. It's work-based learning. That's how surgeons are trained. And that program goes on for many years before you're really qualified to be a surgeon. Now, what do we do with our high school kids who are struggling? They've already been in the education system by the time they get to 9th grade for at least 8 years, right? Many of them have struggled. If they've struggled, they aren't doing well. What we often say is, let's double down on what hasn't worked. Let's give them more math, more English. We're going to lock you in a room, close the windows, and see if this is going to solve it. Not surprisingly, it usually doesn't work. They usually don't succeed in that approach. What they found out in Europe is if you broaden the horizons and say, you know, okay, well, maybe you haven't done that well in the classroom. We're going to give you an apprenticeship. You're going to go out and find out what's going on in the real world. That's when some people really come to life. It's a very effective approach of education. And so they found out that for most teenagers, not all, but for most teenagers, they learn more if you take this approach to education. Secondly, it's going to lead to higher attainment. Why? If you're engaged in your education, you're much more likely to stay in school than if you're bored. And unfortunately, the reality remains that for too many of our high school students, high school is simply boring. They're bored to tears. Why else would the Department of Education report that only 12% of our kids are proficient in U.S. history? It's not because the textbooks don't have any information about U.S. history. It's that the kids are totally tuned out. They're not paying attention to that material. If they're engaged in their studies, they're more likely to graduate. And thirdly, this is obviously a much better pathway to the workforce if you're studying something that's relevant to the economy as opposed to strictly academic instruction. So it's really a powerful case for vocational education. Now, I don't want to suggest these foreign systems are perfect. They certainly are not. They've got many flaws. What we are suggesting is that we're an outlier in the approach we're taking to education. Other countries have recognized the importance of a broader approach. We have not gotten on that bandwagon. We think we can use the principles and practices of these other systems to develop a better American approach. So that leads me to the recommendations we made. Remember, when we started the project, we were asked, what can we do to really make a significant difference, not just help a few kids, but actually move the needle on education reform? And we think there's three things we need to do. The first one is multiple pathways. Let's offer our kids in Nebraska and elsewhere more than one way to move forward. For some, it is going to be a very academic program of study. There's no question about that. For others, though, they're going to need a broader approach, career and technical education, for example. Secondly, and this is where you and the business community come in, we need to expand the role of employers. Matter of fact, we don't think we can solve the problem without engaging employers in a much more fundamental way in helping our young people succeed. And the third thing is what we're calling a new social compact with young people. Now, that's not a call for socialism. What we're saying is let's bring together the kind of people we've got here right this morning, educators, business leaders, policymakers, and say, how can we come together to do a better job of preparing Nebraska's young people to succeed? So let's take a more careful look at this. If we are going to offer multiple pathways, what do we need to do? The first one is career education has to be the core of this. We need to offer high, world-class quality career education. Now, you already have some great examples of this in Nebraska. We have it around the country. The problem is we tend to have islands of excellence. A lot of young people don't have access to this, so they can't go down this pathway even if they want to. Or they might take a career education program that's second or third class. They're really not going to get the skills they need. So that's the first thing. Secondly, and this is vitally important, we have to really make a commitment to provide high-quality career counseling. And I think this applies to all of your kids and all around Nebraska. Why don't we talk to them about what they want to do with their life, whether they're going to a four-year college, a technical college, the military, or whatever. They need to figure out where they're heading, what are their options. Most of them have no idea what's going on in the economy. As the Commissioner of Education already told us, many people in the school system, that's all they've had exposure to. They can tell a student what to do if they want to become a teacher. They have no idea what kind of jobs are available elsewhere in the Nebraska economy. We have to address that challenge, because otherwise, how are they ever going to get there? They don't even know the jobs are available. And the third thing is we need to expand opportunities for work-based learning. There's several reasons for this. Work-based learning, whether that's an internship, an apprenticeship, or an actual job, exposes you to what's going on in that industry. What makes it exciting? What makes it tick? Is this a good fit for you? It allows you to acquire skills you need to succeed in that industry, and as we've already discussed, it's a great way to really bring learning to life. So we already have some good examples of high-quality career education in the U.S. And let me just talk about a couple of these. One is Oklahoma. I know Oklahoma has been a huge rival for Nebraska in football, certainly when you were part of the Big 12. But one thing they've got going on down there is they had a governor named Dewey Bartlett who said he really wanted to make Oklahoma the national leader in workforce development. So they went around the country, they looked at what other states were doing, and they set up a series of technology centers. And some of these centers are truly world-class facilities. They're just incredibly impressive. They are fully supported. Oklahoma is about as red a state as you're going to find. There's not a lot of Democrats down there. It's certainly not a liberal place. But the business community is 100% behind these technology centers. And they actually support that with tax dollars, believe it or not. There's an ad valorem tax that helps pay for this, which is fully supported by Oklahoma business. So the way these work is educators get together with the business leaders and say, what skills do we need in this part of Oklahoma? In Tulsa, for example, they have a great program of diesel truck maintenance because there's a lot of trucks going back and forth. They train you on what you need to be a diesel truck mechanic. Now you might say, well, that's a loser job. I don't think so. Those jobs start at about $40,000 a year and move up from there. And again, this is in a state where the average person is making less than $30,000 a year. It's really a step in the ladder up to the middle class. And don't forget that many of our kids are living in poverty right now. So if you can offer them a job paying $40,000 a year, that's really a victory in many ways. So the Oklahoma Technology Center is one great model. In Massachusetts, where I live, we have something called regional vocational technical high schools. Now, these are public schools and really the true definition of school choice. The way it works is, because we have so many small towns in Massachusetts, they've banded together and created these regional high schools that offer vocational education. I'm proud to say I have 3 kids. My youngest child actually goes to one of these schools. It's called Minuteman because it's located right next to Minuteman National Park, where the American Revolution began in Lexington. And what they do there is they offer 20 career majors. You spend your first semester of high school looking at the different 20 options and then choosing one to major in. My son chose culinary. He wants to become a chef and go into the hospitality industry. So for the rest of his time in high school, he has 1 week on his culinary major, 1 week on academics, and he's going to come out incredibly well prepared. As a matter of fact, he already knows where he wants to go as his next step. So it's a phenomenally successful program. As a matter of fact, the graduation rate from these high schools is 10 points higher than the statewide average, and even the academic scores are very impressive. Career academies are another option, and you've got some of these here in Nebraska. These are usually schools within schools that focus on a specific career theme. They offer students instruction in that theme and hopefully culminate with an internship where students get paid at least some kind of stipend for working as an intern. And the military also offers lots of lessons about how you can train people for career success while they're on the job. So again, we have some great examples. The problem is we haven't taken these to scale. We really need to expand them. Now, if we're going to do this, and this is a big part of what we need to talk about today, we have to overcome some big barriers. One is cultural resistance. I'm sure all of you realize, and many of you have probably seen this personally, that we tend to stigmatize these other types of education as somehow not the best for our kids. We need to move beyond that and recognize in today's economy, for many kids, this really is the best pathway forward. It actually raises levels of success. It exposes kids to the real world. We need to embrace that and get over this stigma that somehow this is the second best form of education. The fact is, the approach we've been taking has been leaving millions of kids in the sidelines. It simply isn't working. We need to move in a different, more realistic direction if we're going to solve the problem. And at the same time, as we change the culture, we need to take these high-quality programs to scale. Now, for those of you in the business community, we think you play a vital role in solving this. And there's 3 things business can do. We're not talking about writing a check and giving it to the principal or superintendent of your school district. We're talking about actually getting directly involved in 3 areas. One is career guidance. As we discussed, we need to dramatically expand and improve career guidance. If we're going to do that, we cannot do that without the business community talking to young people about what kind of jobs are available. What do they pay? You know, if my son was here today, he could give you chapter and verse about every step in the culinary industry. What do you get paid as a line chef? What do you get paid as a sous chef? What does it take to become an executive chef? He's only completed his sophomore year in high school. He already knows all that stuff, and he can tell you how much you're paid depending on what what position you have. Most of our young people have no idea what jobs are available or what they pay or what the economic realities of life are. The business community can help close that gap. Secondly, you can help design high-quality programs of study because you understand what it takes to succeed in construction, manufacturing, agriculture, whatever. And thirdly, you can provide opportunities for work-based learning. In fact, business is the only one that can do that. That cannot be done by government because if we're going to provide opportunities to work on the job, obviously the people who provide the jobs have to have those opportunities. So we have some good examples of how this can be done in the U.S., how it is done. The first robotics competition was launched by Dean Kamen. He's the guy who invented the Segway. He's come up with a lot of other inventions. He felt we weren't putting enough attention on innovation in the United States. And so he launched the robotics competition, which is active here in Nebraska and around the country, where they send out kits. They ask kids to build robots out of those kits, working in conjunction with engineers and other adult mentors. They then start competing, and it culminates in a national competition. There are now thousands of young people involved in that, getting directly exposed to the excitement of innovation. In Wisconsin, they've got a youth apprenticeship program, which allows young people in high school to get about 900 hours of experience working in a field and often getting college credit for doing that. The National Academy Foundation runs over 500 career academies across the U.S., which have had an outstanding record of success in terms of getting those kids to graduate from high school and continue their education. And Year Up is an exciting program really focused on disengaged young adults. What do we do about the young people who are not involved in education, don't have a good job, they're between the ages of 18 and 24, they deal with them. So finally, we need a new social compact. That's what we're going to be talking about this morning, or today, in terms of Nebraska. What does this mean for Nebraska? How can we address this problem right here by bringing together all of the key stakeholders? So, as I say, a number of states have already responded to this in a very meaningful way. The state of Washington is considering a major new piece of legislation called the Career Pathways Act. We're going to be hearing a presentation about that later today from one of the authors of that act. In New York, they've asked us to come in and help them re-examine their so-called Regents exam. That's considered the Class A high school diploma in New York. Right now, to get that diploma, you have to pass 5 academic exams: English, math, American history, and there's also one called Global Studies. And what they're saying is, instead of just offering students the option of taking 5 academic exams, why don't we allow them to substitute a career-oriented assessment in the place of the Global Studies one? So they're looking at broadening the definition of success in the state of New York. And finally, in Illinois, they've developed something called the Illinois Pathways Initiative, which is really, at this point, been under development for 3 years. They're bringing together business along with educators to develop higher quality career education in the state of Illinois. And as we go forward, maybe we can talk more about that. So in terms of the Pathways Project, where we're going is, the first thing is we're organizing right now a national conference called Creating Pathways to Prosperity. We expect teams from many states to attend, probably more than 20 states. It's going to be held next March at Harvard. We hope there's going to be a really strong team from Nebraska there. And there's going to be also other national organizations that are very concerned about this, like the FFA, for example, which is represented here today. One of the key issues we have to address here in Nebraska, by the way, is how are we going to help those kids who live west of Lincoln in rural Nebraska figure out what they're going to do with their life? That's a problem we cannot ignore. It's going to certainly require use of a lot of digital technology to make them aware of what the opportunities are and how they can be successful going forward. We're also hoping to, coming out of the conference, to expand the network of pathway states. Right now we're working with 6 states, but that's just the starting point. So what we're really trying to do is create a national movement to change the culture of education in our country, make it more practical and realistic so that more of our young people are going to succeed. So going forward today, I think there's 2 issues. One is, let's address what's the current situation in Nebraska. What's the challenge we're facing? Who are the kids who are being left behind? What do they look like? What's the mismatch between the education that's being offered right now and the employment opportunities available in the state? How can we address the skills gap in Nebraska? And how can we create an effective pathways movement? And remember, the objective at the end of the day is how can we create a system that's going to allow every young child, or certainly almost all of them, to succeed as adults, to find their place in this society so they can be productive citizens rather than living in their parents' basement, unemployed, homeless, whatever. We want to avoid that. We want to help them find a pathway to success. So that's the challenge part of it. In terms of solutions, there's 4 major solutions we're going to be talking about today. The first one is, how do we promote and expand world-class CTE in Nebraska? So more kids have the option to get this instruction that's really going to help them succeed. Secondly, how can we provide effective career counseling? That's a vitally important issue regardless of where a young person is going, whether it's a 4-year college or some other pathway. Thirdly, how can we expand work-based learning in Nebraska? And finally, how can we forge more effective business education partnerships? This has to be a close working relationship between the business community and our educators if we're going to succeed. And finally, as a closing note, I'd like to argue that everybody in this room has a role to play in this. I think the fundamental problem we've gotten into is a cultural problem. The idea that there's only one road to heaven, and that consists of going to a 4-year college. If we're going to change that mentality and move to a different direction, each one of you is going to have to talk to friends and associates and get them engaged in a discussion. And believe me, as I've gone around the country, I've rarely met anyone who doesn't have somebody in their family who's struggling with this, whether it's that young man like Brian or many other examples I could cite, young people who just didn't get on the road to success. I'm sure many of you know people like that in your own family and in your neighborhood. You can get directly involved in talking to people about the culture we've got to education, how we can expand the number of pathways and create a more effective approach. Another thing you can do is organize a local conference. This is a statewide gathering. You might want to think about holding a conference right in your local community, wherever that is in Nebraska. You can get involved in nationally. We're certainly going to want a strong team from Nebraska at the national conference next March. Those of you who are involved in education need to work to raise the bar in career education and career counseling, and employers need to enlist other companies to get involved in this. We're going to need help from a lot of companies in Nebraska, not just those in this room, so we can provide more work-based learning and mentoring. So thank you very much for your attention, and I really look forward to the remainder of the day.